For 10 years I was the one who took the family photo. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, my mother-in-law would gather everyone by the fireplace, and then she'd turn to me with that soft, practiced smile and say, "Rachel, honey, would you mind? You're so good with the camera." And I'd step back out of the frame and take the picture of a family I'd married into but was never allowed to be part of. 10 photos. 10 years. In not one of them do I exist. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was imagining the pattern, that a person can't be erased that politely. But you can. You can be erased with a smile and a camera handed to you like a gift. Then, 3 weeks after we buried Eleanor, the family's grandmother, the estate attorney's office called. They had instructions to read the will to one person before anyone else. Not my husband. Not his mother. Me. Only me. And the woman who left those instructions had watched every one of those 10 photographs being taken. Let me go back to the beginning because a call like that only makes sense if you understand the 10 years that came before it. My name is Rachel. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the daughter of a woman who did other people's taxes for a living and a father who left when I was 6. We weren't the kind of poor that makes headlines. We were the ordinary kind, the kind where you learn early that you are responsible for yourself, that no one is coming to save you, and that dignity is something you build with your own hands because nobody's going to hand it to you. I met Michael Whitmore in my late 20s. He was kind, a little soft, the way people can be when they've never once had to fight for anything. And he came from a family that had money the way some families have a last name, quietly, assumingly, as though it had always been there and always would be. The Whitmores weren't billionaires. They were the comfortable, established kind of wealth that a small city produces, the family whose name is on a wing of the hospital and a pew at the church. When Michael brought me home the first time, I understood immediately that I was being evaluated. And I understood, just as immediately, that his mother had already decided the answer. Her name was Diane. And Diane had a gift I have never seen matched before or since. She could make you feel small while appearing to everyone watching to be nothing but gracious. At that first dinner she asked me what my parents did for leisure, knowing full well my mother worked weekends. She complimented my dress and then asked sweetly where I'd found it, in a tone that made the words sound like a diagnosis. Every sentence was a door held open and then closed on your fingers so quietly that if you flinched, you were the one being dramatic. I want to be fair because for a long time I tried very hard to be fair, to give them the benefit of every doubt. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was reading insult into ordinary things, wearing a chip on my shoulder from a childhood that taught me to expect rejection. I spent years entertaining that possibility, because the alternative, that a family could decide to quietly freeze out one of its own and smile the entire time, seemed too petty to be real. People don't do that, I told myself. Grown adults don't organize a decade-long campaign of politeness against a daughter-in-law who never did a thing to them. Except they do. I've since learned that they absolutely do, and that the smile is not a contradiction of the cruelty but the delivery system for it. A family that would never dream of saying an unkind word can still make sure, year after year, that you are never quite in the picture. The first family photo happened that first Christmas. I remember it with a clarity that still surprises me. Everyone assembled by the tree, and I moved to join them, actually stepped toward the group, and Diane said, "Oh, Rachel, would you take it? You have such a good eye." And Michael's sister handed me the camera before I could answer. I looked at Michael. He just smiled and turned toward the tree. And I took the picture. I told myself it was nothing. One photo. Favor. That's how it always starts, isn't it? Not with a slammed door but with a small favor you're too polite to refuse. I didn't know it yet, but I'd just taken the first of 10. And I didn't know that somewhere in that house, an old woman in a wingback chair had watched the whole thing and understood it better than I did. The thing about being slowly erased is that no single moment is ever big enough to name. That's what makes it work. If Diane had ever once said, "You don't belong in this family," I could have fought that. You can fight a sentence. What you can't fight is a decade of small arrangements, each one individually deniable, that add up to the same message delivered 1,000 times. You are not one of us. You are here on sufferance. You are useful, and that is different from being loved. It was the camera every year, yes. But it was so much more than the camera. It was the seating at dinner where I was always at the end, always next to whoever was least important that year. It was the way conversations would close a half-inch when I walked up, the group turning like a flower away from shade. It was the Christmas gifts where everyone got something personal and thoughtful, and I got a gift card every single year, the exact denomination of a message. It was being introduced to new people as Michael's wife, never by my name, as though I were an accessory he'd acquired rather than a person who'd walked in on her own 2 feet. And it was Michael. I have to be honest about Michael because he's the part that took me longest to understand. He wasn't cruel. He never once joined in. But he never once stopped it either. When I'd try to talk to him about it gently, carefully, he'd get this pained look and say, "That's just how Mom is. She doesn't mean anything by it. Don't make it a thing. Don't make it a thing." As if the thing were my noticing and not their doing. I have since learned that this is how most cruelty actually survives in families. Not through the one who wields it, but through the good people around them who find it easier to manage the victim than to confront the source. I want to speak directly to anyone listening who knows this feeling. The holiday table where you brace yourself. The group photo where you're always slightly to the side, or holding the camera, or just stepping out. The relative whose kindness has a blade folded inside it. You are not crazy and you are not too sensitive. Exclusion doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes the quietest rooms are the ones doing the most damage, and the people telling you to let it go are the ones who benefit from you staying quiet. And here is the quiet damage that kind of exclusion does, the part that doesn't show. It doesn't just hurt in the moment. It gets inside your own head and starts doing the family's work for them. After enough years, I didn't need Diane to put me at the edge of the frame. I put myself there. I'd arrive at gatherings already braced, already small, already reaching for the camera so no one would have to ask. I laughed a little too quickly at jokes that stung. I made myself useful compulsively because usefulness felt like the only membership I was allowed to buy. I became, without noticing, an expert in my own disappearance. That's what long exclusion does. It recruits the excluded person into the project. And the cruelest thing is that you start to believe the smallness is just who you are, rather than a costume they fitted you for and you were too tired to take off. For years, I managed it the way you manage a chronic pain. I got smaller. I volunteered for the camera before I could be asked, to spare myself the sting of being asked. I stopped expecting my name. I built a whole architecture of self-protection out of lowered expectations. And it worked mostly until the year I met the one person in that family who looked at me and actually saw a human being. Her name was Eleanor. She was 81 years old. And she changed everything, though it took her death for me to understand how much. Eleanor was Michael's grandmother, Diane's mother-in-law, the widow of the man who'd built the family's fortune out of a chain of hardware stores back when a handshake still meant something. She was, in every way that mattered, the source. The house they gathered in for the photos was her house. The money that made them comfortable was money her husband had earned and she had shrewdly kept. And here is the thing I noticed in my very first years in that family, the thing that told me everything. Everyone orbited Eleanor's money. Almost no one sat with Eleanor. She was parked, that's the only word for it, in a chair in the corner at every gathering. People would pay their respects the way you touch a shrine, a kiss on the cheek, a "how are you feeling, grandmother?" and then drift back to the warm center of the room where the real family was. She was treated as a kind of monument, revered and ignored in the same gesture. And she saw it. Eleanor missed nothing. Her body had slowed, but her eyes were the sharpest in any room she entered. And I think that's exactly why the family had quietly agreed to talk over her head. It's easier to make decisions about a person's money when you've convinced yourself she's already half gone. I ended up next to her by accident that first real conversation. I'd been exiled to the corner as usual, and there she was, and rather than sit in silence I asked her about a photograph on the side table, an old black and white of a young couple outside a storefront. And Eleanor looked at me, really looked the way no one in that house had looked at me in years, and she said, "You're the first person to ask me about that picture in a decade. Everyone else in this family has decided they already know every story worth knowing." Then she told me the story. It was her and her husband, 1961. The day they opened the first store with money they didn't have and courage they couldn't afford. I sat there for an hour. It was the best hour I'd spent in that house. After that, I sought her out. Not out of strategy, I want to be clear about that, because later people would try very hard to say otherwise. I sought her out because she was the only person in that entire family who treated me like I was real. We were two outsiders, in a way. Me, the woman who married in and was never let in. Her, the woman who built it all and was now being politely shelved. We recognized something in each other. The excluded always do. I started visiting her on my own, apart from the family gatherings. I'd bring her the lemon cookies she liked, and we'd sit in her kitchen and she'd talk. About her husband. About the business. About her son, Michael's late father, and the daughter-in-law Diane, whom she described once with a precision that made me laugh out loud, as a woman who has never in her life picked up a check she couldn't be seen paying. I didn't know it then, but those afternoons in Eleanor's kitchen were the beginning of the only real family I ever had in that house. And they were the beginning of something else too. Because Eleanor was about to start showing me things the rest of the family desperately did not want me to see. The friendship deepened over about 2 years, and in that time I became, without ever planning to, the person who actually took care of Eleanor. Not the family. Me. When she needed a ride to the cardiologist, I drove her because Diane was swamped and Grant, Michael's uncle, was always traveling for reasons no one could name. When her prescriptions got tangled, I sorted them. When she wanted to go to her husband's grave on their anniversary, I was the one who took her, and stood a respectful distance back while an old woman talked to a headstone, and drove her home and never told anyone because it was hers and not a story for the dinner table. I need you to understand that I never asked her for anything. This matters, and it will matter enormously later. I didn't know exactly how much Eleanor was worth, and I didn't want to know. What I wanted was the conversation, the sense of being useful to someone who appreciated it, the strange gift of being needed by the one person who'd never made me feel like an intruder. In a family that had spent 10 years teaching me I was disposable, Eleanor made me feel essential. You don't put a price on that. Or at least I didn't. Others in that family were doing exactly that, in ways I hadn't yet discovered. Because as I got closer to Eleanor, I started to see the machinery around her. And it was uglier than the polite cruelty I'd learned to survive. I noticed that Diane had started handling all of Eleanor's mail. I noticed that Grant, who I'd rarely seen give his mother the time of day, had suddenly become very interested in helping Mother with her finances. I noticed a new man in an expensive suit at one gathering, introduced vaguely as someone helping the family with some planning, who spent the whole afternoon talking to Diane and Grant and not 1 minute with the woman whose planning it supposedly was. And I noticed Eleanor getting quieter about certain things. One afternoon in her kitchen she said, almost to herself, "I asked Grant about the account at Meridian and he told me not to worry about it, that he'd taken care of it." She said it lightly, but her hands were still on the table, too still, and I'd known her long enough by then to read the stillness. Eleanor was not a woman who liked being told not to worry about her own money. Something was wrong. I could feel it the way you feel weather change before the sky does. I didn't say anything that day. What was I going to say? I was the outsider, the camera girl, the woman with no standing and no proof and a husband who'd tell me not to make it a thing. Who was going to believe me over Diane and Grant, the respectable Whitmores, the family whose name meant something in that town? That's the trap the isolated always fall into. The very fact that you have no standing is what makes you safe to ignore. And the people doing wrong know it better than anyone. They had chosen their target, Eleanor, precisely because she was old and alone, and they had chosen to ignore me precisely because I was nobody. Both choices were about to prove to be the biggest mistakes of their lives. But I started paying attention differently after that. I started really watching. And the more I watched, the more I understood that the family's polite cruelty toward me had never been the real story. It was just the part one could see. The real story was happening in the accounts, in the paperwork, in the quiet rooms where a group of comfortable people had decided that an old woman's money was already theirs, and that the only obstacle left was the old woman herself. And now apparently me. Started with a check. Eleanor showed it to me herself, confused, holding it at arm's length the way she did when her reading glasses weren't enough. It was a canceled check from her own account, made out to cash for $8,000, in an amount in a hand she didn't recognize. "I didn't write this," she said. Not frightened, just puzzled. And then something crossed her face that was worse than fear. It was the dawning understanding of a sharp person realizing that the people closest to her were counting on her not being sharp anymore. I asked as gently as I could whether she wanted me to look into it. And Eleanor, who had spent 2 years letting me in one careful inch at a time, looked at me for a long moment and made a decision. She got up, went to a drawer in the sideboard and came back with a folder. Inside were bank statements she'd been quietly setting aside for months. And even to my untrained eye, sitting at that kitchen table, the pattern was unmistakable. Withdrawals she couldn't account for. Transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. A credit line against the house, her house, that she had no memory of opening. Thousands of dollars month after month, bleeding out of the life she and her husband had built. Here is where I have to explain something because it took me a while to understand it myself. What I was looking at has a name. It's called elder financial abuse, and it is one of the most common and least prosecuted crimes in this country. It almost never looks like a stranger and a stolen credit card. It looks exactly like this. Family members with access and authority, quietly moving an aging person's money into their own control, one reasonable sounding step at a time. A power of attorney signed just in case. A joint account added to make things easier. A trusted son handling the investments. Each step defensible on its own. All of them together, a robbery in slow motion, committed by the very people who are supposed to be the last line of protection. And the cruelest part, the part that makes it so hard to fight, is that the victim is usually isolated first. That's the playbook. Cut off the outside eyes. Discourage the friendships. Make sure that anyone who might notice is kept at a distance and dismissed as a meddler or a gold digger. I sat at that table and realized, with a cold drop in my stomach, that I was the outside eyes. I was the friendship they hadn't managed to discourage. That was why in the last year Diane had grown noticeably colder even by her standards, why there'd been comments about how much time I was suddenly spending with grandmother, why Grant had asked me, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, what exactly I got out of visiting an old woman so often. They didn't see love. People like that never do. They saw a competitor. They looked at me caring for Eleanor and assumed I was running the same play they were, just better because I'd gotten closer. It genuinely did not occur to them that a person might sit with a lonely old woman for no reason other than that she was worth sitting with. And that failure of imagination, that inability to conceive of a motive that wasn't greed, was the first crack in everything they'd built. Because Eleanor could see the difference perfectly. And Eleanor was already quietly doing something about it. "I've taken care of it," Eleanor told me, the day after she showed me the folder. "You'll see. I'm not the fool they've decided I am." I begged her to let me help to go to the bank to call someone. She put her hand on mine and there was steel in it. "Rachel, if I move too fast, they'll say I'm confused and take control of everything to protect me. I've seen them lay the groundwork. So we're going to be smart. We're going to be quiet. And we're going to be patient. Can you do patient?" I almost laughed. I'd been doing patient for a decade. Patient was the only thing I was truly expert in. So we were quiet. But quietly I started to understand the scale of it because Eleanor let me. She'd kept records like the businesswoman she'd always secretly been. The woman who'd done the books for the hardware stores while her husband worked the floor. And the records told a story. Grant had gotten himself named on a power of attorney 2 years earlier, during a hospital stay, when Eleanor was medicated and frightened and told it was a formality. Using it, he and Diane had steadily liquidated a portfolio Eleanor's husband had spent 40 years building. Some of the money had gone into Grant's failing businesses. Some had gone into Diane's lifestyle, the renovations and the trips and the appearances that the Whitmore name required. And a chunk of it had simply vanished into accounts I couldn't trace from a kitchen table. I want to pause on the moral weight of this, because I think it's easy to hear rich family fights over inheritance, and tune out, as though wealthy people's problems aren't real. But strip away the money and look at what was actually happening. A woman in her 80s who had built something real and cared for everyone around her, was being robbed by her own children in the last years of her life, while they smiled at her over the holiday turkey. They were stealing her security, yes, but they were also stealing something worse. They were stealing the truth of her final years, forcing her to sit in a corner and pretend not to know that the people she'd raised were picking her pockets. That's not a rich person's problem. That's a human being's nightmare. And it happens in families of every income every day to people who trusted the wrong relatives. There was a night I drove home from Eleanor's with my hands shaking on the wheel, the same way they'd shake for very different reasons later. I thought about telling Michael. I actually rehearsed it. But I already knew what he'd say, because I'd heard the smaller version of it for 10 years. Don't make it a thing. That's just how Mom is. You're overreacting. And I understood, finally and completely, that the man I'd married was not going to be able to see his own mother clearly, and that whatever came next, I was going to be facing it more or less alone. Except I wasn't alone. I had an 83-year-old woman with a folder full of receipts and a plan she wouldn't fully explain. Trust me, Eleanor said. The last time we spoke about it directly. When the time comes, you'll be the one they call. Not them. You. And on that day, everything will make sense. I didn't understand what she meant. I thought she was rambling, maybe a rare soft moment. She wasn't rambling. She was telling me exactly what she'd done. I just wasn't ready to hear it yet. In the last year of Eleanor's life, the family made their move to cut me off, and they were not subtle about it. They'd finally decided I was a genuine threat. Diane began scheduling Eleanor's family time in ways that conveniently never included me. When I called the house, I'd be told Eleanor was resting. When I came by, Grant was suddenly there, hovering, making sure we were never alone. They'd sensed that Eleanor and I had something they couldn't see into, and people who are stealing cannot tolerate a room they can't see into. The worst of it came at what turned out to be the last big family gathering, the 10th photo. By then Eleanor was frail in a wheelchair, but her mind was as clear as a bell, and I know that because of what she did. When Diane began the familiar ritual, arranging everyone by the fireplace, and turned to me with the 10 years practice smile and the words, "Rachel, honey, would you?" Eleanor cut her off. In front of everyone. In a voice that had run a business and buried a husband and missed absolutely nothing for 83 years, she said, "No. Rachel sits next to me. Someone else can take the picture this year." The room went still. It was the first time in a decade anyone had interrupted the ritual, and it was the matriarch who did it. Diane recovered quickly, of course, laughing it off, but I saw her eyes, and her eyes were doing math. And then, because people like Diane always find a way, when the photo was actually taken a few minutes later, there was a small commotion, a child needed something, the arrangement shifted, and somehow when the shutter clicked I had been moved to the very edge, half-turned, blurred, while Eleanor's wheelchair had been angled just enough that the seat beside her held a side table instead of me. It was masterful, honestly. Even when the matriarch herself commanded it, they found a way to erase me. I have that photo now. I'm a ghost at the edge of it. It's the last photo taken before Eleanor died, and I am barely in it, which is either the perfect summary of 10 years or the setup for everything that came after. Turned out to be both. 2 weeks later, Eleanor called me herself on the phone, which she rarely did. She asked me to come over alone in the morning, when she knew Grant would be traveling. When I got there, she was in her chair, small and tired, but her eyes found me and sharpened. She held out an envelope. "Don't open this now," she said. "Put it away. If anything happens to me, and it will, I'm old, not stupid, you call the number inside before you call anyone else. Before Michael. Before any of them. Do you understand me?" I took it. My hands were unsteady. "Eleanor," I started, and she squeezed my hand with a strength that surprised me. "You were the only one who ever just sat with me," she said. "I saw all of it, Rachel. Every year. Every photo. I saw who stepped back and I saw who did the stepping. I'm old. But I never once looked away." Those were nearly the last words she ever said to me. She died in her sleep 19 days later, and the envelope sat in my drawer unopened until the morning everything changed. Eleanor's funeral was, in its way, the 11th photo. I want you to picture it because I lived it and I'll never forget it. The family arranged themselves in the front pews, the grieving Whitmores, Diane in tasteful black accepting condolences like a queen receiving tribute. And me? I was seated toward the back, next to a cousin's teenage kids, having been told there wasn't room up front. At the reception I was asked twice to help carry trays, because even at the funeral of the one person who'd loved me, my role in that family was to hold the camera and serve the food. I did it. I carried the trays. I was too hollowed out to fight, and honestly a part of me thought, this is who they are, this is who they've always been, and Eleanor is gone now, so this is the last of it. I thought I was at the end of the story. I was actually standing in the middle of it. The most obscene part was the money talk, which started before Eleanor was even in the ground. I overheard Grant in the hallway telling someone about the estate and getting things settled quickly. I heard Diane at the reception mention offhandedly that they'd need to decide about the house. Her house, Eleanor's house, as though the body were not still warm. They were so certain. That's what I remember most. The absolute, unshakable certainty of people who believe the world is arranged for their benefit and always will be. They had spent years quietly moving Eleanor's money into their control. The will, they assumed, was a formality. The reading would just make official what they'd already helped themselves to. I need to say something to you directly now because if you've stayed with me through all of this, you've felt something familiar in it. Maybe you've been the one in the back pew. Maybe you've been the one carrying the trays at the gathering where you were supposed to be a guest. Maybe you know exactly what it is to love someone inside a family that treats you like staff, and to wonder if being good and being invisible are the same thing. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. Because these stories are really about one thing. They're about the moment the quiet, decent, overlooked person discovers that being underestimated was never the same as being powerless. And mine was about to arrive in the form of a phone call. It came 3 weeks after the funeral on an ordinary Tuesday, while I was doing the dishes. An unfamiliar number. A calm professional voice. "Is this Rachel Whitmore? My name is Howard Abernathy. I'm the attorney handling Eleanor Whitmore's estate. I have specific instructions from my client to speak with you before I speak with anyone else in the family. Are you able to come to my office on Thursday? Alone?" I stood there with the water running over my hands, and I asked him the only thing I could think of. Was there some mistake? Did he perhaps want my husband, Michael? There was a pause, the particular pause of a careful man choosing his words. "No mistake, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "My instructions are very specific and they name you. Your mother-in-law was extremely clear about the order in which things were to happen." And I remembered a folder full of bank statements and an envelope sitting unopened in my drawer. and an old woman's voice in a quiet kitchen saying, "You'll be the one they call. Not them. You. And on that day, everything will make sense." I hung up the phone and I sat down on the kitchen floor. And for the first time since the funeral, I cried, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. I opened the envelope that night. Inside was a card with the same lawyer's number, and a note in Eleanor's careful hand. It said only this: "Rachel, tell Mr. Abernathy everything you saw. He already knows the rest. Thank you for sitting with me. Love, Eleanor." I read it maybe 40 times. Then I called Michael's name into the other room, and I made a decision that surprised me. I didn't tell him about the meeting. Not out of revenge. Out of a bone-deep certainty finally that this was mine, and that for once in 10 years I was going to walk into a room on my own 2 feet, exactly as I'd walked into his family the first time before they taught me to shrink. Thursday, I sat across from Howard Abernathy, a precise man in his 60s who'd been Eleanor's attorney for 30 years. And he told me what Eleanor had done. 2 years before her death, quietly in his office, she had rewritten her entire estate plan. She had known, he said, exactly what Grant and Diane were doing with her money. She had come to him not confused but furious, cold and clear, and she had restructured everything. The bulk of the estate, the investments that remained, the accounts they hadn't found, and the house, Eleanor's house, the house where 10 photographs had been taken without me in them, she had left to me. Not to Michael. To me by name, Rachel, in language so specific and so clearly reasoned that Abernathy said he'd rarely seen a will so obviously built to survive a challenge. I couldn't speak. Abernathy slid a box of tissues across the desk with the ease of a man who has done it many times, and he kept going because there was more. Eleanor had not only left me the estate, she had deposited with him the evidence, the folder of bank statements, a forensic accounting sheet quietly paid for herself, documentation of the forged power of attorney, and the liquidated portfolio, and the credit line against the house. And he said, and this is the part where I finally understood the depth of that woman's mind, a series of videos. Eleanor had recorded herself over several sessions in Abernathy's office, lucid and composed, stating her wishes, explaining exactly why she was disinheriting her son and daughter-in-law, and naming on camera in detail what they had stolen and how. She anticipated they would claim you manipulated a confused old woman, Abernathy said. So she made certain there would be no confused old woman for them to point to. Only a very clear one on video telling the truth. I asked him the question I had to ask. Why me? I was the outsider. The camera girl. I had no claim, no blood, no standing. Abernathy took off his glasses and looked at me, and he said something I will carry for the rest of my life. Mrs. Whitmore told me she was leaving her estate to the only member of her family who ever wanted her company more than her money. She was quite specific that this was not a reward. She said, and I wrote it down because I wanted to get it right. It's not a gift. It's a correction. A correction. 10 years of being erased, and Eleanor, from beyond her own grave, was picking up the pen and correcting the record. And the family that had spent those years so certain of their inheritance was about to learn that the old woman in the corner had seen every single thing. They contested it, of course. The moment the will was read to the rest of them, and they learned that the outsider, the nobody, the woman who carried the trays, had been left the house and the bulk of what remained, they did exactly what Eleanor predicted. They hired a lawyer and they filed a challenge, claiming undue influence. Their theory was the oldest one in the book, and honestly the only one available to them. That I was a scheming gold digger, who had wormed my way into a vulnerable old woman's affections, and manipulated her into cutting out her own family. In their version, I was the criminal. That's the part that still amazes me. The people who had actually robbed Eleanor stood up in a courtroom and pointed at the one person who never took a dime, and called her the thief. Inversion of guilt, complete and shameless. For about a week it frightened me. They had money for lawyers and I had a folder and an old woman's word. But I'd forgotten who I was dealing with even in death. Eleanor had built her case the way her husband built stores to last. When our attorney Abernathy responded to their challenge, he did not argue. He simply produced. He produced the videos, Eleanor calm and sharp and devastating, looking into the camera and saying, "If you are watching this, then my son Grant and his sister-in-law Diane are trying to overturn my wishes. Let me be very clear for the court about why I made them." He produced the forensic accounting. He produced the forged power of attorney, with an expert prepared to testify that the signature was not Eleanor's. He produced the bank records showing exactly where the stolen money had gone, into Grant's businesses and Diane's lifestyle, dollar by traceable dollar. The challenge did not just fail. It detonated in their hands. Because the moment they put Eleanor's competence at issue, they opened the door to all of it, and everything Eleanor had documented came into the record. The undue influence claim collapsed within a month. But the real reckoning was the evidence itself, which did not disappear just because they withdrew their challenge. Elder financial abuse is a crime, and the documentation Eleanor left was handed to the authorities. Grant and Diane were looking at forced restitution of everything they'd taken, and at a criminal referral that would follow the Whitmore name into every room it had ever felt so comfortable in. The family whose name was on a hospital wing was now attached to a very different kind of record. I did not gloat. I want you to know that because it matters and because Eleanor would have wanted it. I didn't stand up in that courtroom and make a speech. I didn't need to. I sat quietly, exactly as I'd sat in that corner for 10 years, and I let Eleanor's documents do the talking, the same way I'd let their 10 small cruelties speak for themselves without ever raising my voice. The difference was that now, finally, someone was in the room to hear it. When it was over, Diane found me in the hallway. For the first time in a decade, she used my name, actually said Rachel, and started to say something, and I realized I had no interest in whatever it was. I'd spent 10 years waiting for this family to see me. I discovered, standing in that hallway, that I no longer needed them to. I went back to Eleanor's house afterward, my house now, and I walked through it alone. And in her bedroom on the dresser, I found something I'd never seen. A single framed photograph. It was me and Eleanor in her kitchen, taken by a homemade one afternoon years earlier, both of us laughing at something neither of us could probably remember. The only framed photo in her private room. 10 family photos I was erased from, and one, the one that mattered, where I was the whole picture. I've thought a lot about what to do with all of it because I think it's the part Eleanor was really testing. It would have been easy to become them. To take the house and the money and wield the vindication like a weapon. To make Diane and Grant feel every ounce of what they'd made me feel. The estate gave me that power. For 10 years I'd quietly fantasized about that exact reversal. I didn't do it. Not because I'm a saint, but because I finally understood something watching that family fall apart. Diane and Grant had spent their whole lives certain that things and status and the right seat by the fireplace were what made you real. They'd stolen from an old woman to protect an image. And they'd ended up with neither the money nor the image nor the one thing they'd never valued, the love of the people around them. They were, I finally saw, the poorest people I had ever met. Becoming them to punish them would have been the only real way to lose. So here's what I did. I kept Eleanor's house and I live in it. Michael and I are still working out what we are. He was not on the will, and watching how he handled that told me more about our marriage than the previous 10 years had. He's trying now to see what he refused to see for a decade, and I'm letting him try without promises. A portion of what Diane and Grant were ordered to pay back, I directed quietly to an organization that helps elderly people being financially abused by their own families. Because Eleanor got lucky. She was sharp and stubborn enough to protect herself. Most victims are not. Most have no folder, no videos, no lawyer, no outsider who kept showing up with lemon cookies. Most just get erased quietly the way I almost was. I keep that one framed photo on my dresser now. Me and Eleanor laughing in a kitchen. And every so often when I pass it, I think about 10 years of stepping out of the frame, of handing over the camera, of being told not to make it a thing. And I think about an old woman in a corner chair who never once looked away, who saw all of it, and who reached out from the end of her life to put me, permanently, in the center of the only picture she ever cared about. They excluded me from the family photo for 10 years. In the end, I was the only one ever really in the family at all. If this story stayed with you, follow the channel and share it with 5 people who need to hear it. Leave a comment about the person who saw you when no one else did, or the family table where you learned to shrink. And if there's a story you want told here, put it below. I read every one. Somewhere out there is another person in the back pew, holding the camera, about to find out they were never as powerless as they'd been made to feel.